At 0644 on December 5, 1941, the temperature outside Klin, northwest of Moscow, sat below -20 degrees Celsius. The snow was hard enough to squeak under boots. The tree line was a black line against a gray sky. Gefreiter Karl Heinemann, 24 years old, rifleman in a forward platoon of a German infantry company, lay pressed into a shallow scrape behind a frozen ditch. His gloves were stiff, his eyelashes kept icing together. He had been awake since 0310 when the runner came down the trench line with a whispered warning. The Soviets were moving again. At 0644, the first mortar rounds landed. They struck behind the German position, punching dark craters into the white ground. Heinemann didn't look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the tree line and on the narrow gap between two birches where the platoon leader said the enemy would come through. His weapon was the German standard, the Karabiner 98k, chambered in 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser, fed from a 5-round internal magazine loaded by stripper clip. It weighed just under 4 kilograms with sling and empty magazine. It was not a modern semi-automatic. It was not fast. It was cheap enough to issue to millions and simple enough to keep running when everything else started failing. At 0649, he checked the bolt. Up, back, forward, down. The action locked with a clean, hard stop. The Mauser 98 system was built around controlled feed and a strong extractor. It tolerated dirt, it tolerated ice. In this cold, that mattered. Across the line, Soviet rifle units had weapons that looked more advanced on paper. Some carried the SVT-40, a semi-automatic rifle with a gas system and a 10-round magazine. Some carried the PPSH-41 submachine guns that could spit bullets in close quarters. The German platoon had a handful of light machine guns and a lot of bolt actions. At 0652, Heinemann heard it first, metal on metal, a faint clatter of gear. Then shapes in white smocks broke the tree line at roughly 250 meters. Ski troops, moving low. A few men rose briefly to fire from the hip, fast. The rate of fire sounded intimidating, the accuracy wasn't. At 0653, the platoon leader shouted a range. Heinemann didn't guess. The rear tangent sight on the Kar98k was simple and precise. The hooded front post stayed clear even as his breath fogged the air. He set the sight low and aimed center mass on the lead figure. He fired. The recoil was sharp but familiar. The rifle's report cracked in the cold and echoed off the frozen ground. He worked the bolt immediately, up, back, forward, down, without taking his eyes fully off the target area. The motion was drilled into him long before Russia. German infantry training emphasized disciplined marksmanship and controlled fire, because a bolt action punishes panic. If he rushed, he missed. If he missed, his squad died. At 0654, the Soviets answered with a burst of semi-auto fire. Several shots snapped through the branches above Heinemann's head. One struck the dirt lip and threw ice into his face. He didn't flinch away. He wiped with the back of his glove. He cycled the bolt again. The Kar98k was not elite. It did not give a soldier volume of fire by itself. What it did give him was consistency, a robust receiver, a long cartridge with high velocity, and sights that let a trained rifleman place rounds where they mattered. In this cold, some SVT rifles began to slow as ice and fouling affected their gas systems. Bolts kept moving. At 0656, Heinemann saw a Soviet soldier stand too high to shoot over a snow mound. The distance was around 180 meters. Heinemann exhaled once, pressed the trigger, and watched the figure collapse back into the drift. At 0657, the tree line erupted with more movement. The attack was not one wave, it was several small groups probing for a weak point. The German platoon was about to learn, minute by minute, whether an inexpensive bolt action and hard training could hold against faster weapons and a rising storm of men. At 0701, the Soviet skiers split left and right, trying to stretch the German line. Heinemann's platoon had no depth. The trench was shallow, frozen, and too long for the number of men inside it. The MG-34 on the right flank opened at 0702, its 7.92mm belt-fed fire chopping the snow in short bursts. The gunner wasn't wasting ammunition. He fired 5 rounds, stopped, fired again. Heinemann stayed on the gap between the birches. At 0704, a Soviet rifleman crawled into the open at roughly 140 meters, pushing his SVT-40 ahead of him. Heinemann watched the muzzle bob. He knew what was coming. Fast shots, not aimed long, meant to pin the trench while others closed the distance. At 0705, the Soviet fired. 2 rounds cracked and went high. The third snapped low and hit the frozen ditch wall. Ice fragments sprayed into Heinemann's collar. He kept his cheek weld. He did not return fire immediately. He waited for the pause that always came when a semi-auto needed a clearer sight picture. At 0706, the Soviet lifted his head for a fraction of a second. Heinemann fired once. The figure dropped flat and stopped moving. He worked the bolt. The motion was mechanical now. The rifle's bolt handle was cold enough to bite through gloved leather, but the action still turned. That was the point. A complicated weapon could outperform a bolt action on a range in perfect conditions. This wasn't perfect. This was a place where lubricants thickened, magazines iced over, and men lost fine motor control. At 0708, the platoon leader ordered a slight shift in fire. The Soviets were pushing closer along a shallow depression on the left. The nearest shapes were now at 90 to 110 meters. That was PPSH range. If the trench got flooded, it would be hand grenades and bayonets. Heinemann's Kar98k was still a rifle meant for distance. But the Germans trained for this too. They trained to fire deliberately, to conserve rounds, to let the machine gun dominate the close fight, while riflemen removed specific threats, leaders, men with submachine guns, men carrying grenades. At 0710, Heinemann picked a Soviet with a drum-fed PPSH-41. The man rose and ran, short bursts stuttering from the hip. The bullets tore into the snow, throwing up white dust but not finding targets. Heinemann tracked him for 3 steps and fired. The runner fell forward and slid. At 0712, more Soviets entered the depression. The MG-34 shifted, but its barrel was already steaming in the cold. The assistant gunner fumbled for a spare barrel case with stiff fingers. That was another reality of German doctrine. The rifleman was not supposed to replace the machine gun. He was supposed to support it when the gun paused. At 0713, the MG went silent for a barrel change. For 15 seconds, the trench felt exposed. Heinemann fired twice in those 15 seconds. Each shot was aimed. Each shot was meant to buy time. At 0713-22, he hit the front man in the depression. At 0713-34, he fired again at a figure trying to stand and throw something, likely a grenade, into the trench line. The figure dropped back out of sight. At 0714, the MG resumed. The Soviet push hesitated. The Kar98k's limitation was obvious now. 5 rounds went quickly when targets were close. Reloading by stripper clip required calm hands. Heinemann's hands were not calm, but the drill was deep. At 0715, he tucked behind the ditch lip, opened the bolt, and pressed a 5-round clip down into the magazine with his thumb. The round slid in clean. He stripped the empty clip out and closed the bolt. At 0716, a mortar round landed closer, within 20 meters, and the concussion punched his chest like a fist. Snow fell into the trench. Someone shouted for a medic. Heinemann didn't turn his head. If he looked, he might stop working. At 0718, the Soviet assault reached its first breaking point. Some men pulled back into the tree line, others stayed prone, firing quickly and wildly to cover the retreat. The German platoon had held, but it wasn't victory. It was a pause between hits. At 0721, the platoon leader moved down the trench, kicking men awake, checking ammunition pouches, pointing to sectors. He stopped near Heinemann and looked at the Kar98k. "Keep it dry," he said. "Keep it clean." At 0723, Heinemann wiped ice from the bolt body with a scrap of cloth. He checked the chamber, he checked the extractor. He listened for the next sound in the trees. He knew the enemy would come again, and next time it would be closer. At 0802, the light strengthened, but visibility stayed poor. The wind pushed snow across the open ground in low sheets. It hid movement at ankle height and made distance hard to judge. The Soviet side used that. They moved in short rushes, then went flat. At 0811, a scout on the German left reported voices close, maybe 60 meters. The platoon leader didn't order a charge, he ordered sectors, he ordered restraint. In this kind of fight, the first man to panic and empty his ammunition was the first man to become useless. Heinemann checked his pouches. 2 full 5-round clips left, plus loose rounds. Not much. At 0817, the next assault began, not as a wide rush, but as a tight push aimed at a single weak seam in the trench line. The Soviets were learning. They pushed where the German wire was thin and where the snowdrifts formed natural ramps. At 0820, the first Soviet grenade landed short, exploding in the ditch and covering the parapet with ice. A second came at 0821 and detonated closer. The blast slammed Heinemann's left ear. He tasted metal. He blinked and saw blood on his glove. Not his. Someone beside him had taken shrapnel. At 0823, a PPSH opened at close range. The burst was fast and heavy, the sound distinct, like cloth ripping. The bullets hit the trench edge and chewed the frozen soil. The Soviets were within 40 meters now. This was the moment the Kar98k looked obsolete. A bolt action asked for time between shots. A submachine gun did not. But the fight wasn't just rate of fire. It was hits. It was stopping power. The 7.92 by 57 mm cartridge carried weight and velocity. At close range, it hit hard through winter clothing. And the rifle's strength mattered too. The Mauser 98 action was overbuilt for this war. Massive locking lugs, controlled feed, a bolt that kept cycling even when grit and ice tried to seize it. A soldier didn't need finesse to run it, he needed discipline. At 0825, Heinemann leaned into the trench corner and fired at a muzzle flash. The shot was almost point blank by rifle standards, about 35 meters. The flash disappeared. He worked the bolt. He fired again at 0825-18, this time at a man stepping onto the drift, trying to look down into the trench. The man fell backward out of sight. At 0826, the MG-34 on the right flank jammed. Not a catastrophic break, but a feed issue, ice and stiff hands. The gunner yanked at the belt. The assistant tried to clear it. For a full 30 seconds, the trench lost its anchor. At 0827, the Soviets surged. A figure appeared at the parapet, close enough that Heinemann could see frost on the man's scarf. Heinemann didn't aim for center mass, he aimed for the shoulder line. He fired at 0827-09. The figure dropped into the trench mouth and stopped moving. At 0827-20, Heinemann's rifle clicked empty. He didn't look down. He could feel it through the bolt travel and the lack of recoil. He ducked, pulled a stripper clip from his pouch, and loaded by touch. The rounds went in, the clip came out, bolt forward, lock down. At 0828, the MG-34 came back to life. The right flank stabilized. By 0831, the Soviet push broke again. A few bodies lay close to the trench line, half swallowed by snow. The rest pulled back into the trees. The Germans didn't pursue. There was no fuel for vehicles, no reserves to exploit anything, and the front was too wide. In early December 1941, outside Moscow, German infantry units were already stretched thin. Winter clothing was short, ammunition resupply was inconsistent. Some divisions were down to fractions of their authorized strength. At 08:49, Heinemann wiped his bolt again. He checked the front sight hood for packed snow. He looked back to the tree line. At 09:03, the first single shots cracked again from the woods. Probing fire. Not an assault yet. A warning. Heinemann stayed low. He waited for the next minute marker to matter. At 9:17, the Soviet probing fire sharpened into something organized. 3 rifles fired in sequence from the left, then a burst from a PPSH, then silence. It was not meant to kill, it was meant to measure response. The German platoon did not give them much. At 9:24, the platoon leader ordered each rifleman to fire 1 shot only if a clear target appeared. No volley, no wasted ammunition. The Kar98k could not compete with submachine guns by volume, so the unit made volume irrelevant. It turned the battlefield into a test of patience and sight alignment. At 9:38, Heinemann saw movement again in the gap between birches, now at roughly 210 meters. A man stood and tried to wave others forward. Heinemann centered the front post, pressed the trigger, and watched the figure collapse out of view. At 9:41, the firing stopped. By 10:10, the platoon was still alive. That was the only victory available that day. At 10:33, the company runner arrived with the next order. Pull back before noon, step by step, covering each other. No panic, no broken rifles left behind. The counteroffensive had widened. German units across the sector were bending west. At 11:08, Heinemann slung the Kar98k and moved with his squad through knee-deep drifts. The rifle's sling bit into his shoulder. The steel was a constant weight. He did not hate it, he relied on it. It was a tool that did what it promised: fire when called upon, cycle in the cold, hold a 0. At 11:26, they reached the next tree line and went prone. The platoon leader checked rifles like a mechanic checking engines. He looked at bolts, magazines, sights. Rifles that stayed functional kept men alive. Rifles that failed became dead weight. In the years that followed, the war changed around Heinemann faster than his rifle changed. In 1942, more German units received semi-automatic rifles in small numbers, and later assault rifles appeared in limited distribution. But the Kar98k remained everywhere, because it was cheaper to produce, easier to maintain, and already integrated into training and logistics. Its 5-round magazine forced fire discipline. Its accuracy rewarded it. German doctrine, machine guns as the squad's backbone, rifles as controlled support, kept the Kar98k relevant even when better weapons existed. Heinemann's life narrowed to routines. At 5 a.m. wake-ups, at 7 a.m. marches, at 1200 brief halts, at 1800 digging. He learned to judge distance by tree height and fence posts. He learned to keep the chamber dry. He learned to carry stripper clips inside his tunic to keep them warm enough to load. By 1943, he had been promoted to Unteroffizier, not for heroism, but for consistency, keeping his men firing when they needed to and not firing when they didn't. At 14:20 on June 6, 1944, while other fronts burned, he was not in France. He was back east, still moving, still retreating, still watching the war consume units faster than replacements arrived. By January 1945, his company was a skeleton. Ammunition was scarce, fuel was scarcer, training was rushed. The old model, disciplined riflemen supporting machine guns, broke down when there were too few machine guns and too few trained riflemen left to execute it. At 16:55 on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Heinemann survived into captivity. When he returned later, he did not talk about victory. He talked about weather, hunger, and small decisions that kept men moving. He studied mechanics after release. He worked in a factory where tolerances and reliability mattered.
He recognized the same logic in machines that he had seen in rifles: a simple design, produced in quantity, maintained by ordinary hands, can outperform more ambitious tools when conditions punish complexity. In the 1960s, he served briefly as an instructor for civilian marksmanship clubs, teaching sight picture and trigger control without ideology. He refused to romanticize the uniform. He focused on fundamentals, breathing, patience, and accountability for every round. The Kar98k outlived the men who carried it. It moved into museums, collections, and history books as a symbol of a war that devoured generations. The rifle's legacy wasn't that it was the best, it was that in real combat, under real cold, with real fear and limited supply, reliability and training could narrow the gap between cheap and elite. And for men like Heinemann, that gap, measured in seconds, meters, and a bolt that still turned, was often the difference between holding a line at 9:17 and disappearing into the snow.